All right, good morning, everyone. All right, microphone is up and running. We're going to go ahead and get started. This morning, we kick off our 6-part series entitled Questions Friends Have About Faith. And they are 6 topics in the form of questions. Questions that are potential barriers to faith, and the faith that we're, of course, interested in here is Christian faith. So we all know people, perhaps the majority of the people we know have some sort of barriers that keep them from a lifestyle of faith. And our goal in this series is to tackle some of these mentalities straight on and equip this body that we need not fear some of these hard questions, but embrace them as opportunities to have some really meaningful dialogue. So a thought to kick us off here, we all grew up with different types of musical taste, all right? Largely that's driven by, what your parents listened to. So probably, a fair amount of you grew up with some of the classic country and western songs, maybe some Elvis or something like that. For whatever reason, I am the influence, or I am the product of a whole lot of Michael Jackson and Beatles, okay? That's just what I grew up with. My parents graduated in the 80s and then kind of had some, formidable years in the 70s. So as far as the Beatles go, I really like to consider myself, much more than just a surface level, appreciator of Beatles music, okay? The surface level stuff is like I Want to Hold Your Hand and Yellow Submarine and Hey Jude, I'm much more into like Blue Jay Way and I Am the Walrus and, just putting on headphones for a run and Magical Mystery Tour, just pumping through that album. So, I like to consider myself just a little bit more than your average Beatles listener, but can we all agree that John was the most talented of the Beatles, right? Does anyone really want to contest that? I mean, George had, a couple really good songs that, I like George. I'm probably more aligned with George's personality. Paul had some really good accomplishments, after the Beatles. But I think John was probably the most talented. He had the greatest tunes after, the Beatles broke up. And does anyone here not recognize, the lyrics in the song that I've got on the screen, Imagine? I mean, is that not one of just the most prettiest songs that, has really ever been written? It is musically, it is really nice. It is pleasant. It's probably John's best song and one that he is best remembered by to really encapsulate who he was as a person. But as Christians, this is a troubling tune, right? Imagine there's no heaven, no hell, no religion. And it's as if the psalm blames a lot of the world's problems on nationalism and religious people. That's kind of a troubling thought. And, this was, somebody correct me here, was this 70s, 80s that this song came out? I don't know. But this is, we're a few decades removed from there, but I think that's the mentality of a lot of people still today. They might blame a lot of the world's problems on some of these issues. So toxic nationalism is not what we're going to get into this morning or in this series. I'll just put a pin in there to, maybe that is something we talk through. But we are going to talk about this idea that, is religion really to be blamed for so much of the trouble that we experience in the world? Or religious people or religious thoughts? Society says that religion is antiquated. That it's just something that we shouldn't even be practicing anymore. That's ancient thinking. The famed astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson says with more education, you become less religious. So he kind of explains away religious people and anybody that's involved with their faith, that they're probably just ignorant. If you achieve those higher degrees, if you knew what he knew, how could you be religious? How could you even play with some of these ideas, these thoughts? Furthermore, there's groups of people that say religion is arrogant, it's misinformed, it's violent, it's chauvinistic, it's homophobic, it's insensitive, and in a lot of cases, religion is just unfair. There's a lot of people that think this way. So I wanted to bring up some of those ideas to frame us from where we're coming from with this series. And with that in mind, would you join me in prayer as we start off this morning? Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have as a body to take these topics head on, these questions that friends have about faith. We want the truth and light of your way to be evident in our responses to these questions and how we live. Father, we ask that in our responses, in our way that we handle these, that we would not be annoying or combative, but that we would be insistent and consistent. May we not display anger or arrogance or impatience, but that we would display compassion for those who have not yet found you and that may be stuck on some of these topics. Be with us this morning and as we walk through this series, and thank you for the body here. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so this series, again, is largely based off of a lot of the dialogue in this book here, Confronting Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin. So not all of the content that we'll be discussing the next 6 weeks is going to come from here, but this is really the baseline that we kind of launch from. This is not a course on apologetics. We're not going through necessarily of a historical perspective of Christian evidences or why the Christian faith is necessarily right, but it's a course on defending the aspects of Christianity that are in conflict with our culture, these neo-Western values that have come about. We want to talk about some of those really tough topics. So, six topics again that are largely from the 6 chapters. I think there's 10 or 12 chapters in this book that we're working through. Questions that someone outside of faith may ask, something that might be holding them back from faith in God or trust in Christianity. So, how can you say there's only one true faith? Doesn't religion cause violence? Doesn't Christianity denigrate women? Isn't Christianity homophobic? How could a loving God allow so much suffering? How could a loving God send people to hell? These are heavy questions. And not only are they hard to answer, but sometimes the people that are asking them are equipped with the biblical backing, right? Like they might read the conquest of Canaan and say, that's a violent God. That's a violent religion. Why is he instituting all this terrible violence that the Israelites were commanded to do as they took Canaan? Somebody might read through the Levitical laws and say, these are outdated and untimely, and they're terrible towards women. They might read through accounts of God's judgment either in the Old Testament or the judgment that's foretold and say, that doesn't sound fair. That doesn't sound like something I want to be a part of. But we must be ready to address some of these topics and again, not fear them. We must be ready to respond in confidence. So quickly here before we get into some more of the meat of the series, just want to again ground us in a lot of our vision initiatives here at the body. So if ever you need a refresher, I'll put the URL right there, withensville.church/vision. Bookmark that on your phone. Good idea to kind of memorize and refamiliarize yourself with these often. But, the first one there, training to follow Jesus, we're accomplishing that through classes like these, through Bible studies. A lot of what we do inside these walls is kind of aligning with that. But these next three, serving our neighbors as missionaries, winning our children to Christ, building intimate and lasting marriages, those are three kind of distinct people groups, three big elements of our lives, and three people groups which may be hindered by some of the topics that we're going to address here in this series. So keep that in mind. Make sure that if there's, a note or, a nugget of information that you can take away from this, these are the people that we want to keep in mind as we work through this series. So, grounding us more on this week's topic, how can you say that there's only one true faith? Put other ways, where do you get off thinking you've got this all figured out? How dare you look down on my beliefs and my truth? How can you be so arrogant to think that Christianity is the only way to God? These, again, are the questions that we're aiming to respond to. Now, before we get too far down the road as to not disappoint and to further kind of free up what we're doing here, does anyone recognize this slide? I was gonna call on Jeff this morning to see if he recognized it. It's from Jeff's class in the spring of this year on the resurrection of Jesus. So, this and that series, which is really good, if you need to look for that, withensville.church/video, maybe a few slides to the right there with the interface, you'll find this series from earlier in the spring. That class and really these 5 minimal facts that came from it are really addressing this question of how can we be assured that Christianity is the right religion or has some sort of historical backing there. Again, feel free to refamiliarize yourself with that lesson. That's not necessarily the question that we're addressing this morning. We're more addressing this idea of how dare we think our beliefs are right and that someone else's are wrong. And should we keep our beliefs to ourselves? So does that sort of make sense? I didn't want to get through this class and not hit this and be like, well, we never got to why Christianity is right. That's not necessarily what we're talking about. It's just, should we be allowed to talk about that? Should we talk to other people about our faith? The world might say that's not a good idea. You should not talk about those things. But we want to talk about why we should and why there's problems with the mentality of not talking about those sorts of things. So it's sort of a universal offense, right? To think that you've got this all figured out and that somebody else doesn't. And to put it this way, it's probably a whole lot easier for us to say to friends and coworkers, Christianity works for me. They might ask you why you go to church, and you say, well, it works for me. Those people are there for me. It's what I've grown up with. It's what I'm used to. It's, somebody let me in. It's what works for me. And that's true, But that's a little bit more vanilla maybe than what Jesus has called us to answer that question, right? How many of us would be more direct with it and say, well, Jesus rightly demands the allegiance of every human being. Would you be willing to say that at work? Would you be willing to say that to your friends? Jesus rightly demands the allegiance of every human being. That's a little bit edgier, right? We might get a few more raised eyebrows to say something like that. And we want to work towards that, and maybe not that line specifically, but we need to be bold about our faith and be very confident of why we believe what we do, and that I feel comfortable talking about this sort of stuff. So, to illustrate sort of the mindset of this modern day thinking, which really isn't very modern day at all, we're going to use this ancient Hindu metaphor, this ancient Hindu illustration, and we'll refer to it as the blind men and the elephant. So there's these blind men who don't know what an elephant is. Obviously, they've never seen an elephant. They don't know what it is they're dealing with. And they go into a room or an open space, and each of them is asked to describe an elephant. Well, one of them would grab the tusk of the elephant or the trunk of the elephant and say, well, an elephant is like a snake. And they're like, Another would grab the ear and say, an elephant is like a fan. Perhaps another, the tusk, and say, an elephant is like a spear. And one of them presses up against the body of the elephant and says, the elephant is like a wall. Another, the leg of the elephant, and say, an elephant is like a tree trunk. And another, the tail of the elephant, and like, an elephant is like a rope. Are any of them wrong? Not necessarily. But none of them are all the way right either. And that's the lesson in this ancient Hindu illustration is kind of how a lot of people feel, right? Is nobody's got the whole picture. You know, maybe all religions are a little bit right and they're all a little bit wrong. Maybe they're all part of the same thing and we all just have different aspects of it that we're following. But no religions are all the way correct, right? So, again, that illustration is the mentality that we want to address this morning. There's probably a lot of people that feel that way, and it's probably sort of a soft atheism, a soft agnosticism, right? People aren't willing to say there is no God or no religion is right, but they'll probably be like, everybody's kind of doing their thing and that's okay. But, nobody's got it all figured out. So I think this is a predominant and growing mindset of the nuns. Who are the nuns? Maybe on the census or some sort of questionnaire when they're asked, what religion they're affiliated with, what church they attend, they're going to fill in that nun bubble. And that's to say that maybe somebody's got it figured out, but they don't, or they're not really subscribing to a particular religion or anything like that. And I think a lot of people with this, there's been this really big movement for mindfulness. Have you noticed that? And, mindfulness. I've seen that a lot in my workplace as sort of this, soft appeal towards meditation and everything like that, which you should do. I think it's sort of a worldly substitute for, what we want to meditate on as Christians through, godliness and prayer and different things like that. So I think people want to be spiritual. They just don't want to subscribe to any one, religion necessarily. And they don't necessarily want to hear about yours. They don't want to they don't want to address some of those sensitive topics because it's uncomfortable, right? But the other, maybe more negative side of this illustration is that people who are one of those blind men with just this small part of the puzzle figured out, they would be arrogant and narrow-minded to try to tell anybody else in that illustration of what an elephant is, because they've only got just a small part of it, right? Again, that is what the world is. That is one of the ways the world sort of justifies all these different religions and maybe why they exist. So suggesting that your beliefs are the truth as opposed to a truth is what a lot of people would just label intolerant. So we want to talk about some of the problems with this worldview. Have I lost anybody yet on, again, just using this blind men and the elephant illustration as a way that a lot of people are thinking today about religion and Christianity and religious people? Does that sort of make sense so far? Do I need to back up anything? All right. So we want to talk about some of the problems with that mentality because we don't want to fear some of this thinking and not be confident enough to have the conversations that we know we need to have as Christians. So, problems with this illustration is there is the problem of respect. And we as Christians, of course, are taught to respect people. If we look at 1 Peter 2 and verse 17, Peter says, show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. So we're expected to respect all people. And so a problem with this illustration is that if you think about it, it's inherently disrespectful to religions. It's patronizing. It's the notion that no one's beliefs should be taken too seriously. And as Christians, we should take our faith pretty seriously. And there's other people of other faiths that take their faith pretty seriously. But there's this growing movement that says, I'm just going to write you off. You're probably a little misguided. So another thing to realize is that elephant analogy, it only works because the teller sees the whole picture. They've got it figured out, but apparently nobody else does, right? But another way to think about this, and something to arm us, is we really should not be offended when people challenge our beliefs. There's this idea and sort of unsaid rule that, again, we shouldn't talk about those things with friends that we're scared to lose, with coworkers, with anything like that, because it's just a little confrontational. But in reality, we should be flattered when people want to ask us about our faith or even challenge our faith. Some people love to argue. There's, maybe you can think of a few in your mind there. I'm not necessarily one of those people, but yes, I do argue occasionally. But I find myself arguing the most, or at least with the most energy, towards people I love, people I care about. I'm very choosy about picking my battles. I tend to only argue topics, with people that are worth the energy for me. So think about that, though. If we love people, if we love our friends, if we love our coworkers, we will contend with them. If we think that they're in a religion or a worldview that is not on the right track, we want them to understand things properly. And by doing that, we respect them. Disagreement is not evidence of disrespect. We should think of it as disrespect is not having the courage or giving the effort to disagree with somebody and ask somebody about their beliefs. A further application of this is to not be fearful of befriending or spending time with someone with whom we fundamentally disagree, with really heavy issues. We should still be friends because we need those opportunities to have these tough conversations and to talk about these tough questions. Another problem with this worldview is the problem of history. The historical facts regarding Christianity cannot be ignored or written off because they deal with religious subject matter. We look at this from a Christian standpoint is, what explains the tremendous growth of the Christian movement? I think a lot of people are just willing to write that off as, I don't really know what happened there, and they don't really dig into why the Christian faith, or maybe even digging into why some other religious faiths took off. But we need to understand those things, and we need to be knowledgeable and willing to talk about those things. So we don't want to ignore history in this standpoint, and not address, again, the culture which says, don't talk about this stuff. You cannot ignore history because you disagree with how it unfolded. There's still groups, maybe not on this side of the world, but there's still groups in the world that believe the Holocaust never occurred, right? I mean, that's a problem of history, right? Until just this last calendar year, there were groups, even in the United States, that did not recognize the Armenian genocide. And if you want to look that up, of what occurred in Turkey several years ago, we've just recently all agreed to recognize, that happened, and that was a bad deal. We're some 200 years removed from the American Civil War, and a lot of us disagree on why in the world we fought that. So we can't ignore some of the more edgier aspects of history, and to do so would be a failure to remember things in the correct fashion. So from the Christian side of things and the problem of history in this respect, there's an extraordinary phenomenon of an early church erupting from a small group of dispirited and cowardly followers of a crucified rabbi to be the world's largest religion. We can't ignore that. And we need to be confident, again, in bringing up the Christian faith in our daily interactions, because that's something that just can't be ignored from a history standpoint. To say that all religions are equally true, as this elephant analogy wants to convey, is really to lose our grip on history. If we look at these three mutually exclusive claims of the three major monotheistic religions regarding the resurrection of Jesus, again, this points a lot towards Jeff's class in the spring. Please, look that up for a refresher. Regarding the resurrection of Jesus, which we want to contend is a historical fact, Christians believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Muslims believe Jesus never died. So those two lanes right there cannot coexist. They can't be part of the same truth. Jews, atheists, agnostics believe Jesus died and stayed dead. So those are three mutually exclusive statements regarding this chief figure of the Christian movement that cannot coexist. So we can't just write off that maybe all religions are the same and part of the same equation. There's big problems historically with thinking that way, and we want to be able to address that with our friends. There's a problem of ethics. I'll get to that verse in one more thought here. There's this neo-enlightenment movement that wants to convey a message of acceptance to all religions and lifestyles. But if we're honest and if we really interrogate that, this line of thinking is not as inclusive as it seems. They'll say things like, a personal truth, what's true for me may not be true for you, and that your truth cannot condemn my views and desires. And as Christians, we cannot be complicit with this worldview, and we shouldn't be afraid to take it on. Let's flash over to 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. And I'm going to read through that. John says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." John's pretty clear here that we can't be complicit with a lot of the ethics of our culture, a lot of the things that are promoted and desired as the right ways of thinking here in our Western world. Core Western ethics are an affront not just to Christian, but most all major religions. This acceptance and pervasiveness of sexual perversion, of blurred gender norms, of the lack of personal discipline and restraint. This idea that fulfillment is seeking personal happiness. This isn't just an affront to Christian religion, it's an affront to most religious people. And again, we should not be complicit with this way of thinking. In reality, this illusion of inclusivity is false. And I think if we evaluated it more closely into how our culture behaves, it's religious views, even radical religious views, are only tolerated as long as those who believe them do not wield political power, right? If the Christianity sort of gets a bad rap in our Western world because that's still the predominant religion. And we seem to ignore some of the rougher edges of other religious groups because they're not in charge, and so they're not necessarily being held accountable there. And just religion, other major religions, because they're not predominant, are not under near as much scrutiny. So, but we as Christians would have a problem with this worldview that everybody's got the all part of the same truth, or all truths are equal, because our scripture, our faith really doesn't allow us to tackle some of those things. So a couple more problems before we wrap it up with some takeaways here. There's the problem of monotheism. In history, great empires accommodated the many religions and belief systems of people that they conquered through polytheism, religious synchronism. The idea that everyone can keep their local and personal gods as long as no one asserted their gods that were higher than the state or anyone else's. And for the most part, this worked in most places. There's some pretty big notable empires that we read about in our history books. But where it never really worked was with this little group of people in the Levant called the Jews. They always had a problem with this. There's one God. And then the Muslims came about and they said, no, there's no God but Allah. There are problems with monotheistic ways of thinking as it contends with this culture of everybody thinking that no religion should be greater than any other. We still do this today, right? We sort of have a polytheism, a religious synchronism viewpoint, and it sounds a little bit like the blind man and the elephant. But the three major monotheistic belief systems cannot comply with an acceptance that all religions are on equal footing. It is in strict violation of what we believe as Christians, a lot of what Jews believe in relating to the Old Testament there, and then Islamic folks also are in disagreement with this way of thinking. So, and the verse I highlighted there is, from Exodus 20, verse 3, where we inherit this monotheistic and placing God ahead of all others from our Jewish forefathers there. You shall have no other gods before me. So monotheism cannot be complicit with this thinking that we're all part of the same truth, or that no truth is above any others. Lastly, there's the problem of Jesus, right? Everybody's got to deal with this guy. Jesus does not leave any room for acceptance of other faiths. And we need to be emboldened by that, and we need to be inspired and encouraged to reach out to others with compassion because of this fact. Let's read John 14 and verse 6. In John 14 and verse 6, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's pretty clear, right? Doesn't sound like all religions are basically the same or all religions are equal. C.S. Lewis put it this way: this teaching of Jesus is either of an egotistical maniac, an evil manipulator, or God in the flesh. And I really like what the author of the chapter put on this particular topic. She says, Jesus claims rule over all of heaven and earth. He presents himself not as one possible path to God, but as God himself. We may choose to disbelieve him, but he cannot be one truth among many. He has not left us that option. So we talked through a few problems, again, with this elephant analogy mentality, right? And what I want to drive home this morning is that it must be compassion. Compassion, not arrogance, not anger, that drives us towards some of these conversations and addressing some of these questions that friends might have. Compassion that drives the Christian to assert that there is only one true faith, not motivated by arrogance. We can respect people by our willingness to confront their beliefs, to care. We should spend the energy and love them and be willing to have these conversations, not from an argumentative standpoint, but out of love. The majority of religious people, the three monotheistic religions, cannot be truth among many. We don't subscribe to that. We cannot be complicit with this growing worldview that you can have your truth and I can have my truth. Our faith doesn't leave room for that. And Jesus himself leaves no room for any other way to God but himself. And that right there is enough to motivate us and embolden us, to give us confidence to continue to have these tough conversations with friends, and to make sure that we contend and talk about these things. So maybe to encapsulate it a bit more, the world says nobody's got this all figured out. It's probably all part of the same thing. You have your truth, I have mine, and we should all probably just shut up about it. But we should be emboldened as Christians, because there's a lot of problems with thinking that way, and there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of just ignorance that goes into that thought, that we should be willing to bring out and contend, and we should be willing to have tough conversations and address these topics. Address these topics head on. So the world will tell you that it's not, but it is okay to believe that Christianity is the one true faith and that there is one true faith. Okay, so where do we go from here? That was kind of one of 6. I will fully admit that I probably took the easier one of the 6. Can religion really be at the heart of all that we see violent in the world? And then again there with the 4 remaining topics, certainly some dicey ones that we want to talk through here. And it's not that we're going to necessarily solve any of these things. It's that we're going to talk about some points that we want to equip ourselves with as to not fear some of these questions. Keep in mind, again, the groups that we're hoping to reach out to from just our vision initiatives. It's our children, our spouses, our neighbors. These are the people we want to keep in mind and people that are going to be asking some of these questions, and we want to be equipped to address them. So thank you for your attention this morning, and appreciate it.